Good evening, and welcome to our Waltham Public Library program, What the Heck is That? With Rudy Ruggles. This program is made possible through CARES Act funding to Federal Institute of Museum and Library Services as administered by the Massachusetts Board of Library Commissioners. My name is Deborah Hoffman, and I organize programs and events for the library. Thanks so much for tuning in. Before we start, I want to let you know how the evening will go. Our speaker will do a 30 to 40-minute presentation, and then he'll field questions. To ask questions via the chat function, use a Google account to sign into YouTube, and feel free to write your questions at any time, and then I'll read them at the end of the presentation. And then following the presentation, I will ask you all to answer a yes or no question as required by our grant funding. Did you learn something by participating in this program? Rudy Ruggles is a trustee at the Charles River Museum of Industry and Innovation, located in Waltham, Massachusetts. Over to you, Rudy.
Thank you very much. I really enjoy the opportunity to talk with everybody this evening. So let me go ahead and share my screen so we can jump into this. All right. So thank you, Deborah, first of all, and the Waltham Library for enabling this to happen, and to all the great sponsors for these talks in general. So I'm excited this evening for the opportunity to share some wonderful artifacts from the Charles River Museum of Industry and Innovation. Although it's closed to the public at the moment, we remain dedicated to our mission, which is to educate people about America's industrial history and to encourage and inspire future innovation. So while we can't do that on site at the moment, we have all kinds of great content online already and are producing more all the time. So I hope you'll check out the website. You see the URL at the bottom of the slide here, charlesrivermuseum.org. I'm also happy to say that this evening, Bob Perry, who is the museum's executive director, is online and signed into the YouTube chat so that he can add any extra helpful hints, add some links, answer questions as they come up, and make sure that I don't get too far away from the facts about the place and its occupants. So speaking of which, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, I'll just take a couple of minutes up front to set some context and tell you a little bit about the museum and its background. So the location is in Waltham. It's just off of Moody Street. For those of you who haven't been there before, it's right next to the Charles River. If you go to the website, it tells you where to park and how to get there. Hopefully we'll be able to open our doors so people can come visit. It's a beautiful location, and it's a wonderful building. So this is the aerial view of the mill complex that used to be the Boston Manufacturing Company. And it's the way the mill looks today. So here is a picture from about 1825, what the Boston Manufacturing Company initial buildings looked like through the eyes of artist Elijah Smith. So there were a lot of firsts at that mill, in those mill buildings. It was the first fully integrated mill, vertically integrated from bale to bolt. Basically, when cotton came in, it left as textiles. It was the first modern industrial corporation, so that it wasn't just a first for inventions and engineering, it also was a first for businesses and business structure. It employed women as the primary workforce for the first time. And a lot of people are very familiar with the Lowell mills. The Lowell mills were built off of the Waltham structure, the way that the mills were organized and the way that the engineering was applied. In Waltham, basically the Charles River ran out of enough power to increase the size of the production, so moved it up to what's now called Lowell. So whatever you see up there, large scale, started here initially, and it's something that Waltham is proud of, and we're proud to have a museum in the location of those early buildings. And it really was a keystone in the American Industrial Revolution. This is what it looks like inside when you get a chance to get in there, it's a great place to poke around. We have exhibits on a wide variety of topics. We'll get into some of the artifacts today, but can barely scratch the surface just in the few minutes that we have together this evening. There's a lot of information on the museum's website, so I do encourage you to go and take a look. And as I talk about specific things, I'll point you to videos or other sources of information there. But like I say, I do recommend you take a look at the website and see what you can see virtually. And then as soon as the doors are open, get in there and see what it's like in person. So the museum itself opened up in 1988 as a museum dedicated to telling the stories of American industrial history, with a particular fondness for the many stories that are rooted in this area, in the Waltham and Greater Boston area in New England. And really it's dedicated to engaging the people's curiosity about the past, the present, and the future innovations that can change the world. So although it's a museum of industrial history, we really do want people to see in the past what can create the future, whether it's through engineering or new business models. So we definitely try to encourage our visitors not just to look at old stuff, but to think about new ideas as well. So that's enough of the background. I know you come here for a history lesson about the museum, but the museum is really a treasure trove of amazing artifacts. And so we thought it'd be fun to highlight a bunch of those for you in an interesting format. So what we're going to do is play a little game, and that game is called, and you can say it along with me, what the heck is that? So the way we're going to do this is I will show you some pictures of an artifact or a set of artifacts at the museum. I'll give you some clues, and hopefully you can sort of play along, try to guess what it is. At first I was going to try to maybe give a multiple choice, but I'd much rather let your imagination go and not try to prompt you too early about what something could be, because it's sort of fun to imagine what people could come up with as potential uses for the things that I'm going to show you. So with that as set up, let's get started. So the very first thing is what you may have seen the picture of it, this picture, in some of the publicity for this talk. All right, so take a look. You can see a little bit. This is sort of looking down the body of the machine. I'll give you a little bit of a hint. It is roughly 1920s era. Here's sort of a top-down look, a little bit before the first one, a little bit earlier in the process than the first one. You can see up here at the top is sort of where this mechanism is. So you can see it rolling down here. And I'll tell you this is a big roll of paper. So if it's not obvious already, this brown material is paper. It gives you some sense for the scale. And I'll tell you this, it makes an everyday item. You may not see quite this version of it every day, but you definitely see the item daily. And this machine can make more than 6 of them a second when it's running. So that's another thing, and I'll tell you about that in a second. All right, so whatever you're thinking about, here I'll add one more picture to it. This is looking from the other direction. So you can see right where my arrow is pointing. Down here is where that second picture was taken from, that direction. So it was looking this way. Now you're looking at the other end, so the receiving end, basically. Set of rolls all through here. And I'll tell you this material, that is all one piece. That's not paper. Okay, that's a belt that feeds around. All right. One thing I will say, so you may notice in the lower right-hand corner, it's a little hazy or a little hard to see in contrast on this picture. The far right picture is taken by Ron Cohen. And if you go to his website, roncohen.com, he's got beautiful pictures, actually, of all sorts of parts of Waltham and the area, but including a whole bunch that he took at the Charles River Museum. And I'll show you some more of his later. We have a lot of photographers who come in and take a look at the machines and notice the beauty in the machinery besides just the engineers who are interested in how things work. All right, so maybe you have some guesses. I'm going to give you one last final hint. That is the product. All right, so if you haven't figured it out, this is a paper bag maker. So it's from about 1920, as I said. It was from the Waltham Bag and Paper Company. This machine was actually a gift of Longview Fiber. So Longview Fiber actually ended up absorbing the Waltham Bag and Paper Company, and it's still a unit of Longview Fiber, which is out in Seattle. The company was started in 1914. But this particular machine, like I say, when it's working, could make 22,000 number 5, which was that fold, candy bags per hour. So that's about 6 a second. So when I say when it was working, it is a labor of, I'll call it love, but it is quite the project to get this thing working. The good thing is we have very dedicated and smart, wise, and interested volunteers who can do such a thing. So let me show you a video of what it looks like when, first of all, this is one of our volunteers, Richard Friedman, will tell you a little bit about what it, how it works, how it does what it does.
Yeah. First of all, if you could just tell us what you're doing now.
So this is the end product, and it is a bag that is overlapped along this seam and glued, and it is folded on this seam and glued. So the trick is to align the paper in the feed mechanism so that they are overlapped like that and not miles away, and not overlapped like that where the glue is on the wrong side. So the trick is to get the glue, which is being added back there, to fold over on the top side. So, so the whole feed mechanism is a bunch of rollers and alignment devices to get the paper folded over.
All right, so that's what the machine is designed to do. Now, you're going to see very rare footage of it actually doing what it's supposed to do for a very short period of time, but we'll take what we can get. So here's Richard again, and here it goes. You can hear the joy. So as you can see, this is where that first picture shows the paper being folded over that sort of shoe gets folded. There's no glue involved in the working of this of the model, because it's messy enough without that. You may have noticed that on this, this is protective of a blade that comes up and basically cuts the paper bags into individual sizes. And then that construction that I was showing you before with the single belt, that's what causes it to essentially press the bag together, cause the glue to stick, and end up in the bin at the end of the process. So congratulations if you figured out paper bag machine. There are 2 great videos on the Charles River Museum's YouTube channel showing the repair process. So if you're interested in finding out more about how do you get a machine like this working and seeing it work, and hearing Richard and other volunteers process on getting that up and running, I highly recommend those. So anyway, all right, good job if you got that one. Our next artifact. All right, so this one, it is a little confusing initially. So I will point, try not to pay much attention to all the background stuff. The main artifact is this long pole down to this gray stand, okay? So the clue is this makes another everyday object. Another picture. So this goes right here, and one of these would be on each of these spikes. Let's give you some sense for how that's structured. This is obviously a close-up of this mechanism down here. So you'll see these are rollers. Got a chain link. This would be turned by hand. All right, and one more picture. And I'll give you another hint. So that, as I mentioned, the initial builders are really inhabitants, the ones who made the mill, who grew it into something spectacular. It was the Boston Manufacturing Company. Their main business was textiles. I'll leave that as a hint. And I'll give you a little close up on that circular disc right in the middle. Now, this is a tough one because it's sort of counterintuitive. But I'll give you one last hint, which is this machine is right next to a loom. And the loom makes two-dimensional material, which is related. All right, so maybe you have some guesses. Here's the final. So these are socks that were made, that says Boston Manufacturing Company. I don't know if they were made by this machine. We actually don't have video. We actually don't have a lot of background information on this particular machine, but it is a sock knitting machine. So here's a drawing of a version of it that's attached to a bench. This isn't exactly the one that I was showing you, but you can see how the those black spindles would hold the thread. The thread was fed down through. That was a long pole, would just keep it away from the mechanism. There's the round mechanism here that would take the thread, weave it together as it spun around, and then that roller would be the thing that would pull the sock material down through. So it makes tubes of socks using a single machine. So as you can imagine, trying to weave that by hand, so anything that would mechanize that process would be, as you can imagine, more than welcome. So I don't know how many you got the sock making machine one. If you did, congratulations, or maybe you've seen one before, but a circular sock making mechanism was a big accelerator of productivity, as you can imagine, in the textile industry. All right, on to the next one. So this one is for a less common product. There are related products that are common, but this you're less likely to see the outcome of. All right, so this just gives you a sense for the overall machine. This is a great example of engineering in support of human craftsmanship. I'll put it that way. So I'll add one more picture and you can see this is where this brown space is on this picture. Now there's something here. So this is looking from the other direction, basically. And those of you who are familiar with pantographs may recognize this structure. And I'll tell you more about that in a second. All right, so this is a close-up on what this disc looks like and what the little piece hovering above it looks like. All right, and I will give you one more hint. Oh, it's more than a hint, this is a giveaway. All right, so as those of you who have seen one before know, this is a pocket watch. And this is the back of the pocket watch. And so what you're looking at is a watch case engraving pantograph. So what happened is, it used to be craftsmen would just freehand etch the back of pocket watches, which, as you can imagine, is very time consuming, hard to get consistent. And so what happened was there was a man named Andrew Hallberg in 1910 who worked for a company called the Star Watch Case Company. And we think that this is probably a Star Watch Case Company machine or mechanism. We haven't confirmed the manufacturer, but that's our best guess, based in Ludington, Michigan. So Hallberg invented a machine that could etch as many as 32 watch backs at once. This one does 28. The pantograph principle basically means you can take one size of rotation or movement and translate that into smaller sizes based on essentially gearing or proportions. So it's a mechanical linkage. It's used for all sorts of things. And in this case, it was used to take a design like this would be a model of, and turn that into an etched design on the backs of multiple watch cases at once. Now, it wouldn't do the full detailed etching. It would create a light surface etch. And so then craftsmen would still have to go back and hand etch to make sure that it got the right amount of detail and that the quality was good. But it was a great example of how you could take engineering principles and use that to enhance what the craftsmen were trying to do and make their job easier. So I'll just show you a couple quick videos to show, first of all, the pantograph principle, which is this one. So you can just see how when you move the arm, it moves that whole basically surface of etching pins that would scratch on the back of the watches. So that's how pantographs work. And then this just shows how an operator would use the pointed piece to sketch over that template. And it obviously still takes a long time, but this was not a quick process to begin with. And so then he or she would just trace the design that was there, and all the watches would end up with a miniature version of that on their backs. There's a YouTube video on the museum channel featuring just a description of how that would work, and it's also worth taking a look at. All right, so I don't know how many of you got that it was a watch engraving pantograph, but congratulations if you got that one. The next one is actually a set of different objects, but they're related. All right, so it's a little easier than a watch engraving pantograph, believe it or not. So here's the first one. You take a look at that for a second. So to give some sense of scale, that box, the wooden box, is probably about 1.5 feet tall, something like that. So here's another one. Starting to see a theme. They do the same thing, slightly different approaches to doing it. All right, here's another one. For those of you who are Mystery Science Theater 3000 fans, this apparently is the Tom Servo version of this device. It's a pretty common machine. Not these versions, but it's a pretty common machine. One thing that's interesting is it took this process from a 2-person job to a 1-person job. So this last one, which is about the sort of like a fat, I don't know, skateboard size, is easier to do with 1 person than the other ones. And just in case you thought that they were all sort of similar, here's another one. Does the same job, totally different principles. All right, so one of the interesting things about invention and innovation is that just because you think you've solved a problem one way doesn't mean that you should stop exploring options for how to solve that problem. So for instance, think about how many ways there are to hold paper together. All right, so all of these devices essentially do the same thing, or they solve the same problem. And for those of you who have big enough screens or good enough eyes, if you can read what's written on some of these, you may have already figured out what it is. And for those of you who can't or haven't, they are vacuum cleaners. Early pre-electric, obviously, vacuum cleaners. So there are a couple of descriptions of a couple of the vacuum cleaners. You see the one on the left was the one that looked like a skateboard, and you could stand on it and go back and forth. Now it was harder with the ones that you had to hand pump for one person to do both things. So you had to put a lot of pressure into that, moving those levers back and forth, whether it was using bellows or some other mechanism, then also to be using the hose. So that tended to be a two-person job. Now, if you didn't mind standing and rocking back and forth on your vacuum cleaner, then you could do it all by yourself. And I think almost as interesting as the ancient artifacts is the ancient ads. So some of these things, I don't know how they go over these days, but the ask your husband for it kind of thing is an interesting positioning for the product. But they made a big difference, and we still need vacuum cleaners today. Now, of course, they're automated, or you wheel them around in different ways than this, but this is how they got their start. The museum does a series of Tuesday Tech Talks, and there was a whole talk on vacuum cleaners. These are actually contributed, or the exhibit is thanks to a man named Dave Fox, he's a semi-retired electrical engineer, and he really enjoys restoring antique mechanical devices and loved vacuum cleaners was one of his main focus areas. So he actually does this, the tech talk that we have on it, that he goes into each of the vacuum cleaners and their history. And then towards the end, he spends a lot of time talking about how he restores them. So for those of you interested in how do you sort of dig into some of these mechanical devices and revitalize them, the old ones obviously don't make parts for them and that sort of thing anymore. I highly recommend that tech talk, and it's fun to see. He gives you much more detail on these vacuum cleaners than I'm able to this evening. But if you guess vacuum cleaners, congratulations. All right. Next. Okay, this is a tough one also. I'm going to show it to you in pieces. Not that I think it's actually easier to guess every time I show you another picture of it, but because there are so many interesting components to it. So this is related to an earlier product. I'll say that much. All right, so this, just to give you a sense for scale, is on a workbench. Okay, and I'll give you another sense of scale in a second. So one interesting thing to notice is up here, there are belts. This is belt driven. One of the main exhibits at the museum is a line shaft belt driven workshop where you have tools that are can be taken on and off the belt devices, and that powers the whole workshop with just a single power source. And you add the belts to a tool when you need it, and then you take them off when you don't, or you engage them or disengage them. So this was an example of one that was a machine that would use belts, be connected to a power source, and that's how the machine would operate. All right, so I'm going to show you another picture. This gives also some sense for scale. Now, I'll show you a second one too. So you'll see two different sized wires in two different parts of the machine. All right, so it's an interesting machine. It uses the wires are not part of of what makes the machine operate. In other words, they're not electrical wires or something like that. These are wires that are used as feed for the product that it makes. And the last clue I'll give you, hint I'll give you, it was used in the industry that Waltham is named for. Not Waltham itself, but what is Waltham called? It's blank city. So if you haven't figured it out already, you probably didn't know it was a screw making machine, but it is part of the watchmaking machinery that we have on display at the museum. Waltham Watch Company obviously was a very famous watch company, world renowned, and the machinery, they had to create a lot of the machinery to make watches as precision, essentially mass produced devices. And this was an amazing machine for us to come across, to be able to absorb into the collection, along with, like I say, several other watchmaking machines. There is on the museum's website, there's something called Trenches and Timepieces, which is just a description of the various watchmaking efforts that went on over time, and highlight some of the history of watches in Waltham. So if you go to the museum website and look under collections, that's there. And there's also a YouTube video that includes Ray Darnell, who was the guy who was instrumental in getting this machine working. And he actually used to come over from England every year and would spend part of his time, part of his valuable time in the US, just working on this machine at the museum. And we're indebted to him for getting it working again. I'll show you a little clip of the machine working, just to show you what happens. But I highly recommend taking a look at that whole video of him describing the process and what it took to get working. This machine was created by a genius named Charles Vander Ward. He's a mechanical superintendent of the American Watch Company. There were only 45 of these machines built, and it cost about $2,000 a piece between 1871 and 1876. And they were used in the screw making department at Waltham Watch Company. So they made a huge difference. It used to be that an individual craftsman could produce maybe 1,200 to 1,500 screws a day. This thing could crank out 50 to 60,000 screws per day. And let me just show you a quick demonstration of what it looks like in action. There's no sound. Well, I don't have the sound on, but it just shows making a screw. And you can see the complicated mechanisms throughout. So if you're interested in more, I do highly recommend going take a look at the video. It's very interesting, even if you don't think you care about making screws for watches. It's a fascinating machine and a great story. All right, moving on. This one was called The Eighth Wonder of the World by Thomas Edison. So take a look at this keyboard. That's probably not like a keyboard you've seen before. Letters seem maybe out of place for what you're used to. About from 1940 or so, this particular machine, although it was invented in 1884. Here's a picture of the keyboard in context. So if you've been to the museum, you know we have actually two of these. Slightly different, but hard to guess if you haven't seen one before. All right, I'll give you a little hint on this. If it's not clear, that little tag has a sign that says lead, as in molten lead. It's not molten there, but because these machines were actually used, we have to make sure people don't play around with stuff that might be bad for them. So it's marked to be careful that there's lead residue there. Now, you probably, unless you've seen one of these before, there's no way you're guessing what it is. But we thought it's worth highlighting. It's what's called a Morgenthaler Linotype. So the Linotype was developed in 1884 by a German immigrant named Ottmar Morgenthaler, and it really revolutionized the world of print. So what would happen beforehand if you printed newspaper leaflets or that kind of thing? You'd have to set all the print by hand, letter by letter. And so what the Linotype did is it would create a way for people to create a line of type at a time, get it, Linotype. And so what would happen is they would press the keyboard it would put the little basically letters together in a line. Then what happened is molten metal would be injected across the assembled sets of letters, which would then cooled would create a line of type. So you could use that whole line at a time. It wouldn't just be one letter at a time. And then as soon as you were finished printing as many pages as you want with that, then you can actually melt down the lead again if you wanted to. So that was used, actually the machines were used basically through the 1950s. And then with digital printing and new technology, it sort of lost ground to photo setting in the 60s and 70s. And there are still people who know how to use and worked on linotypes, but there are fewer and fewer. So we were lucky enough to have somebody who had worked on linotypes actually run it for us for a while. So you can see what it looks like in action. So let me just run that video for you. He's obviously not trying to type specific things. He's just making the machine work. But you can see it just ejected a line of type into the set to his left. And those, when collected, would be a printable surface. So anyway, that's the linotype machine. Probably not many people guessed unless you already knew what one was, but I just figured it was worth showing off that one and fun to see it in action. All right, so last one. All right, so this one, I bet a lot of people will guess this one, if not at the first picture, pretty soon. It is one of the main events at the museum when people come and visit. So if you've ever been there, you'll probably figure this one out pretty quickly. And if you haven't, see how many pictures it takes to get there. All right, so this is the first one. See, it's a pressure gauge of some sort. I'll give you a little timelines from about 1850. All right, this is probably a pretty good hint. So this is another Ron Cohen photograph. And again, just, I guess I would encourage, a lot of people think the Museum of Industry and Innovation is going to be only for tech people or engineer people or tinkerers or that sort of thing, but it really is for artists too. There's something there for everybody to enjoy. So we'll look forward to having everybody back when we're able to open the doors. All right, so this shows those pressure gauges in context. This is the back view. It's probably getting clearer if you haven't figured it out already. These might be some sort of indication. Right below this is a place to put in coal. This is a boiler. And this is probably everything you need to know. So this, I'll do the final picture. This is Waltham engine number 1. And it was donated actually by an industry leader in Waltham named W.H. Nichols. And we have a whole exhibit on him. There's a lot on the website about the Nichols company and Nichols family that is well worth checking out. This just became a passion project of his. When it was being retired, he bought it from the city, and we're very lucky to have it in our collection. So a lot of people think when they look at the boiler, they think maybe that's how the machine was powered, like it was a steam powered vehicle or something like that. It wasn't. The power came from horses to drive it. What the steam was used for, the boiler, was to pressure the hose so that it could project water for long distances. So the flow rate of steam pressured hoses, it wasn't hot water that was sprayed out. That was added to the power of the hose to take water from a source and spray it out. The flow rate was 850 gallons a minute, which was the highest of any pump made until the 1950s. Again, this is back in the late 1800s that this was created. It was built by Muskeg Locomotive Company, which is the top class. It was actually Waltham's first powered firefighting vehicle, and it was in service in Waltham from 1871 until the 1930s. It was actually used by the Waltham Fire Department to help put out the Great Boston Fire of 1872. They flatbedded or train bedded it into the location, so they didn't have to take the horses all the way in to get there. But once it was in there, it was used in fighting the fire. And today, it's mainly used by kids for great photo ops, but it's a great part of the collection of the museum. We're very happy to have it and highlight some of the history of Waltham as well. So I hope you all did well on our quiz, that you learned a little bit and enjoyed a little bit. There's a lot that we do at the museum. Some we can't do unless it's in person. We've had, however, a really interesting time transitioning to virtual versions of a lot of our events and activities. As I mentioned, we have the Tuesday Tech Talks. There are Mill Talks, which tend to be more historical in nature. We have music series and all kinds of cultural events and that kind of thing. So even though we can't get people there in person, I hope you'll take advantage of what we have virtually. And one more thing to keep in mind, as Deborah said at the beginning, think about, did you learn something by participating in this program? So in the chat, just yes or no is fine. You can answer now or in a little bit, but now we're gonna go and talk a little bit, see if I can answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Rudy. That was fantastic. And we had a really active chat audience. People making lots of guesses, and many of them were accurate, which I was pretty impressed by. So I think everyone had fun. I did see that there were a few questions that people asked that Bob Perry, the museum director, was able to answer in the moment. So that was cool too. And I'm just looking to see if people are answering the question, did you learn something by participating in this program, which is required by our grant. So please do answer. And if you have any other questions for Rudy or Bob Perry, please do ask them in the chat. I'm not seeing any right now. So we may have answered all those lingering questions, but I'll give people a few moments. I was just impressed at the intricacy of all of the machines. Just so many moving parts, so many little pieces, which obviously had a very specific role in making the whole thing happen.
Yeah, one of the things that was fun in just putting this together was trying to go back to the video that we've had of various things working, because it's one thing to go in and see the paper bag machine and read a little bit about it, but if you can see it running for a bit or hear the process about what it takes to get something like that moving, or see the watch screw making machine work with those tiny wires and realize, oh my gosh, somebody had to solve so many mechanical and engineering problems to figure out, and I don't think I mentioned this, but that particular model was able to handle multiple size wires, so different size screws. It used to be that a single machine would make a single screw, but then they got better and better. So there were two different, I pointed out the two different wire types. And thinking about the engineering that goes into solving those problems is just fascinating. And like I say, even if you're not an engineer, if you realize, oh yeah, I guess my socks were made somehow, and somebody had an early version of that, and now there's more sophisticated robotic versions, but vacuum cleaners came from somewhere.
Yeah.
It's fun to see.
Yeah. Let's see. So everyone who responded did say they learned something.
Good.
But including Bob Perry.
That's It's nice of
And
them to say
I
that.
don't see any lingering questions.
Great.
Oh, here's a question. What was the principal time period for these types of machines and technologies that make them obsolete?
Let me see.
Which I understand that.
It might depend on the context of the machine. So for instance, linotypes, they had a good long run of it, till the 1950s even. And then, innovation came along and different solutions would come out that it made it so that was no longer the fastest, best, cheapest way to get a job done. So things tend not to die out in and of themselves. They tend to be, they get something else comes along and takes its place. And it's interesting. There's some things that will go away after 15 years and some things that will go away after 100 years. And I think obviously industry is accelerating in the pace of change and how quickly technologies come on board. But I mean, there's a lot of work that's been done academically as well as in historical collection context about the diffusion of innovations as well as the waves of invention and innovation that come along. Obviously, an innovation in one area can have huge ripple effects. So linotype, for instance, once you start making it easy to print things, so it used to be that there were newspapers would be no longer than 8 pages. They'd come out maybe once a week, every 2 weeks. It's just very labor intensive and hard to create ongoing production of printed material. And then when you have something like a linotype that comes along, you can create daily papers, you can create pamphlets much more easily. And that obviously creates a communication change that has its own ripple effects. So it's there's no one easy answer to that. So it's very context specific, but it is an interesting thing to watch. Pick an object and see what the invention cycles look like and the innovation curves.
Let's see. One person says, I used to work at Panametrics in the Crescent Street watch building. Did they originally power that plant with steam or hydro? Do you know that?
I don't know that one. No, I'm afraid I
don't know
don't.
that. Okay.
Maybe somebody else in the chat might know. I know, for instance, at the location, the Charles River Museum is actually in the powerhouse for the mill complex. It was created later on. It wasn't one of the first buildings, as you may, I don't know if people could tell from the painting, but where the museum was built sort of in a second phase of buildings. It was created as a powerhouse because the initial mills were just powered by water power. It would turn wheels and turbines and basically underneath the buildings and that sort of thing. After a while, they needed to supplement that with steam power and other power sources. So the building that the museum is in was was a boiler house essentially. And so there a bunch of the manufacturing and other productive industries in the areas did go through a power change. If anybody's familiar with Waltham knows that there's the dam just upstream from where the museum's location is, right where Moody Street is. So it was a great source of hydropower, that the Charles right there. That was one of the main reasons that it was chosen as a location for Boston Manufacturing Company. But even that hydropower sort of didn't do enough to power all the industries that were starting to get created along it. And so, like I said, Lowell became a location. Other places that had more hydropower and other opportunities for stronger power sources came along.
Let's see. There's a little bit of chat. Bob Perry is adding his 2 cents about these items. One person wants to know what the Watch City Bike Lab is.
Oh.
That's on your screen.
Yeah, it's an organization that we work with. It's several people who love bicycles, maintaining bicycles, fixing them. And when we were open, they would regularly, especially during the warmer months. Now that there's a path that goes right by the museum, it used to be, for those of you who've been around Waltham for a while, it used to be that the pathway that came off of Moody Street and headed down river would just end at the museum's front door, which was fine if that's where you were going. But if you were taking the path, if you wanted to keep going along the Charles, it was very inconvenient. So it actually now extends to the right of the front door of the museum and stays alongside the river. So now it's a great bike run, walk route. And so the Waltham Bike Lab would set up, usually on the weekends or on holidays, and fix people's bikes, repair tires, that sort of thing, and just teach people how to do bike maintenance. So it was, and we hope to have that up and running again when we have the museum open. But that's what that is.
Great. One person asks, did you ever see the master clock room under the management office? I guess at the Crescent Street building, in the watch company.
Oh, I never have.
Okay. Someone says the path is now continuous. That is awesome. Yeah, I don't see any other questions.
Right.
So I think we can call it a night. And I thank you so much for your time and for putting this together. It was a fascinating tour of history, really. And I certainly learned a lot. So thank you very much. And thank you all for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed it. Good night, everyone.